Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're going to take a look at the scarcest factory version of the Chassepot that there is. This is the model of 1866 Chassepot rifle for the African cavalry. And these are so scarce today that when I first wrote my book, Chassepot de FAMAS, on French military rifles, not only did I not have one, I couldn't find one that I could get pictures of even. Now, since then, I have come across two. One of them is this one, and one of them is in the reserve collection of the French National Army Museum. And it's very exciting to be able to show you this one if you are a huge French rifle nerd. So the deal here is, of course, France had substantial territorial colonial holdings in North Africa when Chassepot was adopted, and frankly through until the 1960s. They had a lot of troops in Algeria, and Algeria is a very large country that, especially at the time, was not particularly densely populated. And so the cavalry were a major resource for the French military presence in Algeria. They needed guys who could move around quite a lot. And when the Chassepot was first adopted, all they had was a full-length rifle version. It would take, well, it wouldn't take that long. It would take a couple of years before they developed a cavalry short version of the Chassepot. Now, it doesn't seem that complicated to do it, but they had a production line going, and they wanted to start getting mainline infantry troops armed with this really impressive, technologically much superior rifle. This is needlefire, it's breech loading, it's fast shooting, it's long ranged, it's accurate, it's a fantastic rifle, and it's much more important to get the infantry equipped with them than to divert resources to building some second production line for cavalry in Africa. But the African cavalry want good new guns, and not like one naturally assumes, I think, today that the colonial troops in Africa would be second, if not third tier troops that weren't particularly high on the list for getting new guns. That's not really the case. There were a lot of very effective, in some cases, downright elite troops in the colonial forces. And so it makes sense that some of these guys wanted to get their hands on the newest, best guns as quickly as possible. And so what happens is in 1868, the general in charge of the French troops in North Africa, General Marguerite, brings in a bunch of standard Chassepot rifles for his guys to experiment with. And, you know, does this going to work for the cavalry? Do we need to change anything? How are we going to work with this new rifle? And the conclusion they come to is, it's a great rifle. The only thing that we really need to mess with is how it's carried, because the original Chassepot has a sling arrangement like a standard infantry rifle, one on the back of the buttstock and one out here on the barrel band. And that just didn't work well for guys on horseback. What they wanted was something that was set up much more like the dragoon rifles that they'd previously been working with. And I'll just use this as an example. Basically, they wanted sling swivels here and here so that they could sling the rifle diagonally across the back where it's balanced. It works a lot better on horseback. That's not an ideal situation for infantry because it takes a lot longer to get the gun off your back and it sticks out to both sides. So if you're marching in tight formation, guns are going to, clank against each other. It's not good. For the infantry, vertically straight up over the shoulder is definitely the way to go. Cavalry are a little bit different. So anyway, by early 1869, they've come up with a set of really basic modifications to make to the Chassepot for the African cavalry troops. And they send it to Mas, the St Etienne arsenal, and proceed to basically get a new version okayed and put into production in 1869. So let's take a look at what they actually changed, because it looks pretty simple, but there are a few details to it. They put a fair amount of thought into this, as simplistic as it seems to be. This rifle is not in fantastically great condition. It has led a long and probably very hard life, so please excuse the condition, but it is a fantastically rare piece, and I'm excited to have it regardless. Now, I figure the best way to do this is to show you this African cavalry rifle side by side with a standard Chassepot so that we can see the fairly subtle differences that you see between the two guns. So first off, we have the difference in sling swivels. The infantry rifle has one back here. The African cavalry one does not. Instead, it has a sling swivel on the trigger guard. The trigger guard is otherwise the same, but has that sling swivel on it. And then looking at the front end of the guns, the standard rifle has a nose cap and a single barrel band with a sling swivel. The African cavalry gun has a nose cap and two barrel bands, one of which has a sling swivel, and neither of which are in the same position as the one on the infantry rifle. This sling swivel is positioned right here so that the midpoint, or the balance point of the rifle, is right on the center of the rider's back so that the gun won't flop around too much. You can tighten the sling down, hold the gun nice and stable. So those are the basic modifications, and they seem really easy. However, there is also a recognition that there's going to be a lot more stress put on this gun if it is bouncing around on a rider's back than if it's just hanging off the shoulder of a marching infantryman. And so there are a number of modifications that are made in anticipation of the need for a stronger stock. And the first one is right here. This reinforcement here was originally considered as a way to repair a broken stock and reinforce it. They decided to proactively put that on all of the African cavalry guns because you're going to be putting a lot of stress on the action right here. Just proactively reinforce it to make sure that there isn't any damage to the stock. Similarly, when we look at the sling swivels on the front end of the guns, this is the standard Chassepot, this is the African cavalry. They went and made this 25% longer so that it has more bearing surface and distributes the load of the sling on more wood and more metal. And that again was done with the recognition that there's going to be a lot more stress on this than there is on the standard pattern. And for the same reason, the stock on the African cavalry guns is actually thicker and heavier than that on the standard rifle. This is a little more subtle, a little harder to see, but if you look at how the stock comes in, how wide the stock is outside the barrel here on the front end of the standard rifle, and then compare it to this, you can see there's a lot more meat on the stock of the cavalry rifle. The nose caps, however, are the same. The bayonet lugs are the same. They did decide that it was worthwhile having bayonet lugs on the cavalry guns. There was some thought, some consideration given to taking the bayonet lugs off. They opted not to do that. There was also some discussion internally of ways that they could reduce the size of the bolt handle to make it less likely to jab into the back of the trooper. If I understand them correctly, there were talks about a bent bolt handle or perhaps a folding bolt handle, and all of those ideas were scrapped, and they just went with the standard, the identical bolt handle that you see on a regular Chassepot. Now, if we take a look at the markings here, we have manufacture, Impérial, St Etienne, model 1866, so the exact same receiver markings that you would get on a standard infantry rifle. However, the military decided that for administrative reasons, they wanted to have these guns in a separate serial number block, and essentially all of the serial number blocks were already pretty well occupied by standard rifle production. But, and I apologize, this is hard to see because it's a little bit under the wood line of the heavier stock. You can see the serial number better up here on the bolt. When they initially made the Chassepots and set up the serial numbers, they were a letter prefix and 100,000 blocks, so A1 through A99999, B1, etc. They had skipped I and they skipped O because the I looks like a 1 and the O looks like either a 0 or a Q. Chassepots, they used a block letter like this. When they went to the Gras, they would change to a script letter. But it was decided that since O hadn't been used, they'd just make the African cavalry rifles O series. So they are the only French rifles you will ever see that use an O prefix. Nothing else, all the way through the present day, has done that. It's a little hard to see under some of the old corrosion, but we also have an S1869 mark here. It's when the barrel was manufactured. St Etienne, 1869. Quite remarkably, the serial number is still just barely legible here, 0828. And on the opposite side, we have the original Macron, which is, this was, the center plug was essentially an anti-theft device. It's a plug of dogwood or boxwood that is basically impossible to hide. Even if you take that plug out, it leaves a hole. It's obvious if it's patched, and that indicates that the gun is military property. Around it is the date, a couple of inspectors' initials, and the date of acceptance into the French military. And 0828 is a pretty early one. This is actually from the very second batch. It is March 1869 that this was taken into service. It did not take very long for St Etienne to get these guns into production. After all, there aren't that many differences between it and a regular rifle once they decide exactly what they want to build. And the very first batch, 270 guns, were ready to ship out in March of 1869. Production picked up in April. By the end of June 1869, the full order of 12,000 were complete and were shipped off to Algeria. They were shipped progressively as they were finished. Along with these, the Algerians, the French cavalry in Africa, an assortment of different units, but in general, they bought 12,500 Chassepot bayonets to go along with them, the standard Chassepot Yatagan saber bayonet. Presumably the bayonets were numbered to match the rifles, plus they had some spares, because 12,000 rifles, 12,500 bayonets. At any rate, they're taken into service in Algeria. They're well liked, they do the job, they're Chassepots, they're really good guns for that time period. However, there's never a second batch made. There are never any more of them made at all, because in 1870, the official cavalry carbine version of the Chassepot goes into production. And it's shorter, handier, lighter, nicer, and any cavalry units that need to be equipped with new Chassepots from 1870 onward are going to get these guys. There's no reason to make more of the long ones. Now, we have some archival records from 1870 and 1871 and 1872 of African cavalry rifles coming back to the arsenal in need of repair, and the orders that were put out at that time were to rebuild any of these guns into standard infantry rifle configuration if they came into the arsenal. So the notes that we have document specifically 1,457 African cavalry rifles being rebuilt in that way. One can assume that more than that actually were later on. Like I said, there were never any more of these manufactured. As they wear out, they're repaired into infantry rifles, and then, in theory, in turn, repaired or modified again into cartridge-firing Gras rifles, metallic cartridge Gras rifles. And just overall, there have never been that many sources of rifles coming back from Africa to Europe. It's a harsh place for military rifles to see service, and a great many of them are not going to survive all that long. There's never been any significant importation of these into France, into the US, into anywhere. They're extremely rare rifles today. The nicest one I'm aware of is in the reserve, as I said, of the Musée d'Armée in Paris. This one's kind of rough. I've seen pictures of a couple others, and it's not uncommon for them to be, for example, missing the rear sights, which seems to be a common African modification. But I think what basically happened is most of these were worn out. Some of the ones that did survive sort of dispersed throughout Africa, where they have been used and used and used until there's just nothing left of them. So it's extremely cool to get a chance to take a look at this one. In fact, they are so rare that when I wrote my book, Chassepot de FAMAS, I didn't have pictures of one of these to put in. So if you are interested in the history of the Chassepot or other French military rifles, well, I did write a book on them, Chassepot de FAMAS, and we have just recently received our third reprint of the book. It is in the warehouse, it is in stock, ready to go, regular copies and signed copies, signed by me. So if you're interested in those, I have a link to the Headstamp webpage down in the description text below. You can check out that and all the other cool books we have, because we're starting to build a pretty cool large catalog. Anyway, I'm very excited to be able to finally present the African Cavalry Chassepot rifle to you. If you're still here at this point, you're a tremendous French rifle nerd, and I salute you for that. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.